The first thing that broke was the sky, not in fire or thunder, but in geometry. It folded inward upon itself like a thought reconsidered too late, angles collapsing where curves should have been, light bending until it forgot which direction meant away. On the outer rim of human-settled space, above a dust-choked moon that had never earned a name worth remembering, the heavens twisted into a shape that no mind had evolved to accept without pain. The watching instruments screamed their confusion into the void, and the people who watched the instruments learned that the universe was about to ask something of them. The moon's surface trembled as if something beneath it were waking. Towers of alloy and stone, raised by human hands over 3 generations, vibrated with a low resonance that set teeth on edge and thoughts adrift. The colony had been built for mining and listening, a place to pull rare elements from dead rock and to keep an ear turned outward, because humanity had learned early that survival favored those who paid attention. The listening arrays were older than the towers, ringed forests of antennae and buried cores of computational mass, all tuned to the faintest murmurs of distant stars. When the sky broke, every array agreed on one thing: this was not a natural event. Ruvan Kesh stood at the central observation balcony, hands braced against the cool railing, eyes fixed on the impossible distortion above. He had been born on a ship between suns, grown to adulthood under artificial light, and still the sight made his stomach twist. The distortion pulsed with colors that had no place on a spectrum, hues that existed only as arguments between wavelengths, and each pulse carried a pressure that pressed inward on his thoughts. He felt watched, measured, and found wanting by something that had not yet bothered to reveal itself. Around him, the command hall buzzed with restrained urgency. Analysts spoke in clipped bursts, their voices overlapping as they chased understanding through streams of data that refused to behave. Holographic projections stuttered and reformed, models collapsing as quickly as they were built. The colony director, a broad-shouldered woman named Tareen Volsh, stood rigid at the center dais, her jaw set in a way that suggested she had already made decisions she did not want to make. Ruvan knew that look. It was the look of someone weighing lives against probabilities. The listening arrays began to translate the distortion into numbers and the numbers into warnings. Energy levels spiked beyond known tolerances, spatial metrics failed, and causality itself showed signs of stress. This was not an arrival in the conventional sense. It was an intrusion, a violation of the assumptions that had governed human expansion for centuries. Whatever was coming did not care how space was supposed to work. Ruvan straightened as a new layer of data scrolled across the primary display. The pattern within the distortion was resolving, coalescing into structures that suggested intent. Not ships, not stations, but something that sat uncomfortably between concepts. Vast planes of matter folded through one another, lattices of force interwoven with living tissue, all moving with a purpose that defied translation. The arrays flagged it as intelligent, and then, hesitantly, as hostile. The first contact protocols had been written with hope in mind. Humanity had imagined meetings across the void, marked by curiosity, caution, and eventually understanding. Those protocols now felt like relics from a more innocent era. Tareen Volsh issued the order to initiate passive signaling, a gesture of presence without aggression, knowing full well that it was likely meaningless. The signals vanished into the distortion like whispers into a storm. When the response came, it did not arrive as sound or light. It arrived as pressure. Every human on the moon felt it, a sudden weight behind the eyes, a sense of being pushed aside in one's own mind. Some screamed, some collapsed. Ruvan felt his vision blur as alien impressions forced their way through his thoughts, not as words but as assertions. You are here, you are small, you are in the way. The entity or entities made no effort to soften the message. It was not cruel in the way humans understood cruelty. It was indifferent, vast, and utterly certain of its own rightness. The listening arrays translated fragments of its intent through sheer brute force, mapping the pressure against known cognitive frameworks. What emerged was a simple truth wrapped in incomprehensible context. This region of space had been claimed long before humanity had learned to crawl between stars, and the claim was being enforced. Tareen Volsch's voice cut through the rising panic, steady and loud enough to anchor the room. Evacuation protocols were initiated, emergency shelters sealed, and defensive systems brought online despite the knowledge that they were likely inadequate. Humanity had learned to fight, but it had never fought something that treated the laws of reality as suggestions. The colony's rail cannons tracked the distortion, their targeting systems struggling to define what could be aimed at. The first shot was fired by reflex, a test burst of mass accelerated to relativistic speed, hurled toward the heart of the folded sky. It vanished without impact, swallowed by a curvature that redirected it into nothing. The entity responded not with immediate destruction, but with adjustment. The distortion expanded, its edges brushing the upper atmosphere, and gravity on the moon spiked violently. Towers groaned, foundations cracked, and deep within the rock, mining shafts collapsed like empty lungs. Ruvan was thrown from his feet as the floor pitched. He caught himself on the railing, knuckles white, mind racing. This was not an enemy that could be repelled by force alone. It did not recognize humanity as a peer or even as a nuisance worth erasing quickly. It was correcting an error, and the error was the presence of humans where they did not belong. As the evacuation proceeded in chaos, a second transmission forced its way through the pressure, sharper and more focused. It carried a map of sorts, an imposed understanding of boundaries and hierarchies. Humanity was not the first to encounter this entity, and it would not be the last. Civilizations rose, expanded, and were culled when they crossed lines drawn by minds older than stars. The universe, it seemed, had landlords. Anger flared in Ruvan's chest, hot and defiant. Humanity had clawed its way from a single fragile world, survived self-inflicted catastrophes, and learned to live among the stars through stubbornness and ingenuity. The idea that it could be erased as an inconvenience ignited something deep and dangerous. He was not alone in that feeling. Across the command hall, eyes hardened and fear began to transmute into resolve. The distortion tightened, focusing its pressure on the colony's core. This was the final warning, the moment before enforcement. Tareen Volsch made the call that history would either curse or revere. She authorized the release of the forbidden data, the records humanity had kept hidden even from itself. The listening arrays were retuned, not to hear the universe, but to shout into it with a voice forged from desperation and pride. Deep within the moon, sealed beneath layers of shielding and secrecy, lay the legacy of a choice humanity had made centuries ago. When first contact with alien life had revealed not wonder but predation, when early explorers had stumbled into civilizations that viewed emerging species as resources or threats to be neutralized, humanity had learned to adapt. It had studied those encounters, learned the patterns of dominance, and quietly prepared counters that no one ever hoped to use. The data released now was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It was a declaration, encoded in physics and intent, broadcasting a simple message. Humanity refused to accept a universe where survival was granted by permission. The arrays tore at the fabric of space with controlled violations, creating echoes of human presence that stretched far beyond the moon. It was a signal meant to be noticed by anything that paid attention to such things. The entity reacted for the first time with something that resembled surprise. The pressure shifted, its focus wavering as it processed the new input. The distortion's geometry fluctuated, edges fraying, as if reality itself were resisting its imposition. For a fleeting moment, the overwhelming certainty of the intruder faltered. Ruvan felt the shift like a breath of air after near drowning. He did not know if it would be enough. He only knew that humanity had chosen to stand rather than kneel. The sky above the moon continued to writhe, but now it did so in response to a challenge it had not anticipated. As the first chapter of this confrontation unfolded, one truth became clear to every human who watched the broken sky and felt the weight of alien judgment. The universe might be vast and ancient, filled with powers beyond comprehension, but it had made a mistake in assuming that humanity would accept its place quietly. The distortion did not retreat, but it changed, and in that change lay the first fragile hint that the universe was not as settled as it pretended to be. The folded sky above the moon loosened its geometry, angles stretching into unfamiliar curves, planes separating as though pulled apart by an unseen tension. Gravity eased in uneven waves, releasing structures from imminent collapse, only to remind everyone that the reprieve was temporary. The entity had not withdrawn its claim. It had paused to reconsider the cost of enforcement. Inside the colony, emergency shelters filled with people who had never imagined needing them. Miners, engineers, data analysts, children born under a foreign sky, all pressed together in reinforced chambers carved from bedrock. The walls hummed with the strain of containment fields, and the air tasted faintly of recycled metal. Fear was everywhere, but it had sharpened, focusing into something harder than panic. People spoke in low voices, trading fragments of information, rumors already crystallizing into resolve. Humanity had been pushed before. It had learned that being underestimated was sometimes its greatest advantage. Ruvan Kesh remained in the command hall, now stripped of non-essential personnel. The vast space felt hollow, every footstep echoing as if the room itself were listening. Displays showed cascading models of the distortion's internal shifts, each projection an argument between competing interpretations. He moved from console to console, coordinating analysis teams scattered across the inner systems via lag-limited channels. If the entity was reassessing, then understanding why might offer leverage. The forbidden data release had done more than announce defiance. It had activated dormant constructs embedded throughout human space, systems designed not for immediate combat, but for long-term survival against existential threats. Autonomous observatories shifted their focus. Archives once sealed under layers of ethical debate unlocked themselves, and distant colonies felt subtle changes in the background constants that governed their technology. Humanity's infrastructure, often criticized as inefficient and overly redundant, revealed its true purpose. It was not built for elegance. It was built to endure damage and keep functioning anyway. The entity's response began to clarify as the listening arrays adapted. The pressure in human minds receded enough to allow more precise translation. What emerged was not anger, nor even hostility in the emotional sense, but calculation. The intruder was weighing humanity's apparent capacity against its own doctrine of control. For the first time, it acknowledged humans as something more than a transient anomaly. This acknowledgement came with a probing action. From the heart of the distortion, tendrils of altered space extended outward, brushing against the edges of the moon's orbit. Where they passed, reality warped subtly. Instruments failed in complex ways, not simply shutting down but reporting contradictory truths. A region could be both empty and full, cold and hot, depending on how it was observed. The entity was testing the limits of human perception and response, mapping weaknesses not just in technology, but in cognition. Ruvan coordinated a counter that would have seemed absurd in another context. Instead of reinforcing the arrays against intrusion, he ordered selected systems to deliberately misreport. Controlled errors were introduced, feeding the entity inconsistent data, mirroring the confusion it imposed. It was a gamble, rooted in a deep understanding of human adaptability. Humanity had evolved not as the strongest species on its home world, but as one that could survive uncertainty. If the entity relied on predictive certainty, then noise might be a weapon. The effect was subtle but measurable. The tendrils hesitated, their progression uneven as feedback loops struggled to reconcile conflicting inputs. The distortion's internal structures shifted again, and this time the listening arrays detected something like strain. The entity was not omnipotent. It was powerful, ancient, and vast, but it operated within constraints, even if those constraints lay far beyond human norms. Tareen Volsh convened a strategic council via secure channels, drawing in representatives from major human settlements, research enclaves, and defense nodes. The lag between systems stretched the conversation into something fractured, but urgency bridged the gaps. The question before them was stark. Should humanity escalate, risking annihilation to assert autonomy, or should it seek a negotiated retreat, ceding territory in exchange for survival? The arguments were fierce. Some spoke of pragmatism, of buying time by yielding ground, while humanity grew stronger in secret. Others argued that any concession would confirm the entity's worldview, ensuring future culls as humanity expanded again. History weighed heavily on the debate. Human records were filled with examples of appeasement bought with blood, of threats that grew bolder when unchallenged. Ruvan listened, offering analysis when called upon, but his thoughts drifted to the nature of the entity itself. It was not a conqueror in the human sense. It did not seek tribute or obedience. It enforced a cosmic order that predated humanity's existence, one that treated emerging civilizations as variables to be managed. In its framework, humanity's resistance was an anomaly, a deviation from expected behavior. That deviation, he realized, was humanity's true strength. Humans had never fit neatly into the roles imposed by environment or expectation. They had reshaped planets, altered their own biology, and refused to accept extinction even when logic suggested it was inevitable. The forbidden data was a manifestation of that refusal, a declaration that humanity would rather rewrite the rules than obey them. The entity escalated its probing. A focused compression of space targeted one of the outer listening arrays, crushing it into a knot of matter that glowed briefly before collapsing into a singularity that evaporated almost instantly. The destruction was precise, almost surgical, a demonstration rather than an attack. The message was clear. It could dismantle human infrastructure at will if it chose to. Instead of recoiling, humanity responded by dispersing. Systems that had been centralized for efficiency fractured into decentralized networks, each node capable of independent operation. Data replicated itself across vast distances, redundancy layered upon redundancy. The loss of the array was absorbed, its functions redistributed. It was a lesson humanity had learned the hard way over centuries of internal conflict and external threat. Never build something that cannot be lost. The entity seemed to struggle with this adaptation. Its internal models, extrapolated from countless prior encounters, predicted collapse following demonstration of overwhelming force. Instead, it faced an opponent that grew more diffuse, harder to pin down, more unpredictable. The distortion's edges flickered as its calculations adjusted, and for the first time, the pressure in human minds carried something new: uncertainty. Communication attempts resumed, not as pleas or challenges, but as statements of existence. Humanity broadcast records of its history, not curated for diplomacy, but raw and unfiltered. Wars fought and survived, mistakes repeated and corrected, the long, uneven climb from fragility to resilience. It was not an appeal for mercy. It was evidence. This is what we are. This is what you face. The entity absorbed the data at a scale that dwarfed human comprehension. Entire epochs of human experience were parsed in moments, patterns extracted and compared against alien baselines. What it found did not fit neatly. Humanity's capacity for violence was matched only by its capacity for cooperation. Its tendency towards self-destruction was counterbalanced by an equally strong drive to rebuild. It was a species that survived not by stability, but by oscillation, by enduring cycles that would have shattered more rigid civilizations. On the moon, as the standoff stretched into hours, the immediate danger eased enough for exhaustion to set in. People slept in shifts, clinging to the routines that anchored sanity. Children were told stories of distant Earth, of oceans and skies unbroken by alien geometry. Adults whispered contingency plans, each more desperate than the last, but all grounded in the same stubborn belief. We are still here. Ruvan stood once more at the observation balcony, watching the distortion churn above. He knew that this was only the beginning. Even if the entity withdrew, it would not forget. Humanity had announced itself not just as a species that existed, but as one that resisted categorization. That kind of presence attracted attention, not all of it benevolent. The pressure shifted again, coalescing into a more structured transmission. This time, it carried not a threat, but a proposition. The entity acknowledged humanity as a disruptive variable and proposed a recalibration. Humanity would be permitted to remain, under observation, its expansion constrained by enforced boundaries. In return, the immediate enforcement would cease. The Council received the proposal in stunned silence. It was the closest thing to recognition humanity had ever received from a power so vast. It was also a cage disguised as tolerance. To accept would mean survival under scrutiny, growth limited by an alien hand. To refuse would mean open conflict with something that could bend space like cloth. Tareen Volsh's response was delayed, not by indecision, but by intention. Humanity needed time, not just to choose, but to ensure that whatever choice it made would be irreversible. The forbidden systems continued to awaken quietly, far from the moon, far from the entity's immediate perception. Deep within human space, projects long deemed theoretical began to transition toward reality. Ruvan felt a grim clarity settle over him. The universe had revealed one of its truths, and humanity had responded by revealing one of its own. This was not a story that would end with a single battle or a single decision. It was the opening movement of a conflict measured not in years, but in eras. As the broken sky held its uneasy shape above the moon, and the entity waited for an answer, humanity prepared to do what it had always done when confronted with an impossible choice. It prepared to change the game itself. The entity waited, and in that waiting lay a pressure more unsettling than overt violence. It did not press closer, did not withdraw, but maintained its presence above the moon with a precision that suggested deliberate restraint. The broken sky became a constant, a reminder etched into every waking moment that humanity now lived under observation by something that could unmake worlds without effort. Time stretched in strange ways as the hours turned into days, and the absence of immediate catastrophe forced humanity to confront the deeper implications of what had begun. Across human space, the quiet awakening accelerated. Facilities that had once been theoretical exercises in redundancy and worst-case planning shifted into active coordination. These were not weapons in the traditional sense, nor fleets poised for glorious confrontation. They were systems designed to reshape the context of conflict itself. Distributed research enclaves synchronized their work without centralized oversight, each pursuing fragments of a shared goal that no single mind could fully encompass. Humanity had learned, through bitter experience, that concentration invited annihilation. Ruvan Kesh spent his days in a state of controlled exhaustion, moving between layers of abstraction that threatened to blur together. He analyzed patterns in the entity's behavior, cross-referencing them against archives of alien encounters that spanned centuries. What emerged was a profile not of a conqueror, but of a custodian. The entity enforced boundaries because it believed boundaries preserved stability. It culled because it believed unchecked growth led to chaos that could ripple across realities. In its framework, it was not a villain. It was a necessary function. That belief, Ruvan understood, was the opening. Humanity did not need to prove that it could destroy the entity. That was likely impossible in any direct sense. It needed to prove that the entity's model of stability was incomplete, that humanity represented not a destabilizing force, but an adaptive one capable of absorbing and dissipating chaos rather than amplifying it. The challenge lay in demonstrating this without submitting to permanent containment. The proposal still hung unanswered, its implicit threat unspoken but omnipresent. Accept observation and limitation or face enforcement. The council debated endlessly, but beneath the surface of every argument ran a current of quiet resolve. Humanity had already begun to act as though the answer would be refusal. The question was not whether to resist, but how to do so without triggering immediate annihilation. The first step was understanding the entity's limits. It operated at a scale that dwarfed human perception, yet it had chosen to focus here, on this moon, on this intrusion. That focus implied cost. Maintaining the distortion, enforcing presence across layered realities, required expenditure. The entity could afford that cost, but not infinitely and not everywhere at once. If humanity could increase the cost without escalating to open war, it might force a recalibration more favorable than the offered cage. Subtlety became the watchword. Human expansion halted outwardly, colony ships recalled or redirected, borders drawn inward to present an image of compliance. At the same time, inward expansion intensified. Habitats grew denser, infrastructures more layered, simulations more ambitious. Humanity turned its gaze upon itself, refining efficiency, resilience, and integration across systems that had once functioned independently. It was not growth in territory, but growth in depth. The entity observed these changes with inscrutable attention. Its pressure ebbed and flowed, probing different aspects of human activity. When it focused on industry, production shifted. When it examined communication, protocols adapted. Humanity treated observation as an environmental factor, like radiation or gravity, something to be engineered around rather than feared. This alone seemed to confound the entity's expectations. Observation, in its experience, induced compliance or collapse. Here, it induced innovation. The first real test came not above the moon, but far from it, in a peripheral system deemed insignificant by most metrics. A human research outpost there reported localized distortions similar in structure, though vastly smaller in scale, to the entity's presence. The patterns suggested an automated enforcement mechanism, a probe dispatched to assess humanity's compliance beyond the immediate focus of the standoff. It was the kind of measure the entity had likely used countless times before, a way to ensure that resistance was not merely localized theater. Humanity responded by allowing the probe to observe exactly what it was meant to see and nothing more. The outpost appeared compliant, its activity reduced, its signals carefully curated. Beneath that surface, however, layers of misdirection unfolded. The probe's observations were subtly altered by human systems that exploited known limitations in alien perception, gleaned from the forbidden archives. It was not deception in the sense of falsehood, but in the sense of selective truth. When the probe attempted to enforce a minor correction, compressing space around the outpost to induce shutdown, it encountered resistance not from shields or weapons, but from engineered inconsistencies. The local reality had been seeded with adaptive feedback loops that absorbed and redistributed the stress, turning a focused enforcement action into diffuse noise. The probe recalibrated, attempted again, and failed again, each iteration costing it more coherence. Ruvan received the data hours later, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten as he traced the implications. Humanity had not just resisted enforcement, it had made enforcement inefficient. The probe withdrew, its mission unresolved, and the entity above the moon reacted with a subtle but unmistakable shift. The distortion tightened, its internal structures rearranging as it processed this unexpected outcome. For the first time since its arrival, the entity initiated a direct conceptual exchange, not imposed pressure, but structured inquiry. It sought to understand the principles behind humanity's adaptation, the reason enforcement did not produce the expected result. The question was not framed in human language, but in relational constructs that translated loosely into a challenge. Why do you persist in patterns that degrade order? The response humanity crafted was not centralized. It emerged from countless nodes, a chorus of perspectives woven into a coherent whole. Order, the response conveyed, was not a static arrangement to be preserved, but a dynamic process maintained through change. Degradation and renewal were not opposites, but phases. Humanity did not resist entropy by denying it, but by flowing through it, redirecting its consequences into new structures. The entity absorbed this, its processing evident in the oscillation of the distortion. This was not merely a philosophical disagreement, it was a fundamental difference in how reality itself was approached. The entity maintained stability by imposing constraints. Humanity maintained continuity by adapting to their failure. Neither was inherently superior, but they were incompatible in their assumptions. As days stretched into weeks, the standoff evolved into something unprecedented. The entity did not withdraw, but it also did not escalate. It observed, probed, and recalibrated, while humanity continued its quiet transformation. Projects once considered too risky to pursue advanced under the cover of existential necessity. Not weapons of mass destruction, but tools of integration, systems designed to harmonize disparate physical laws at their boundaries. Humanity began, cautiously and imperfectly, to learn how to exist at the seams of reality rather than within its comfortable interiors. On the moon, life settled into a strange rhythm. The broken sky became a fixture, its presence incorporated into daily routines. Children grew accustomed to it, their games incorporating the ever-shifting patterns above as casually as previous generations had incorporated weather. Adults worked, argued, and slept under its watchful distortion, the constant pressure forging a shared understanding that would outlast the crisis itself. Humanity was changing, not through sudden transcendence, but through prolonged exposure to the impossible. Ruvan often returned to the balcony, watching the entity's presence with a mixture of dread and fascination. He understood now that this was not a war in any conventional sense. It was a negotiation between worldviews, conducted through physics and persistence rather than words. Humanity was not trying to overthrow a cosmic order. It was trying to prove that the order was incomplete without it. The Council finally drafted a response to the original proposal, not as acceptance or refusal, but as counter-definition. Humanity acknowledged the entity's concern for stability, but rejected enforced limitation as a solution. It proposed coexistence without containment, observation without constraint, interaction without hierarchy. It was a bold stance, one that would have seemed delusional weeks earlier. Now, it felt like the only position that aligned with what humanity had already become. The message was transmitted, layered with the same principles humanity had demonstrated in action. It did not threaten, it did not plead, it asserted continuity. Humanity would continue to exist, to adapt, and to expand in depth if not in breadth. Any attempt to prevent this would incur costs not just to humanity, but to the stability the entity sought to preserve. The entity did not respond immediately. The broken sky remained, its geometry shifting in slow, thoughtful patterns. Pressure lingered at the edges of perception, less oppressive now, more contemplative. Whatever the entity was, it was not incapable of change. It was ancient, but not immutable. As Chapter 3 of this unfolding confrontation drew to a close, one fact had become undeniable. Humanity had survived first contact not by matching power with power, but by refusing to be simple. The universe had encountered a species that did not fit neatly into its categories, and that encounter was forcing even ancient custodians of order to reconsider the shape of stability itself. The entity's silence stretched beyond any human measure of patience, not as absence, but as sustained presence without reply. The distortion above the moon settled into a slow, deliberate cadence, its internal motions smoothing as if a storm had chosen to become a current. The pressure that had once clawed at human thought receded to a distant weight, noticeable only when one tried to remember what unburdened perception had felt like before. Humanity waited, not in stillness, but in motion constrained by vigilance, aware that whatever answer came would shape not just borders, but identities. Ruvan Kesh found that the waiting changed people more deeply than the initial shock had. Fear had burned hot and fast, leaving behind something denser. Conversations grew quieter, more deliberate, as if every word carried the awareness that it might one day be examined by an intelligence older than stars. Arguments still flared, because humanity did not know how to exist without them, but they resolved differently now, with less emphasis on victory and more on coherence. Survival under observation required not unity, but compatibility. Across human space, the adaptive projects entered a new phase. With the entity no longer actively enforcing, but still observing, the constraints shifted from immediate defense to long-term coexistence. Researchers pushed into domains once considered philosophically dangerous, not because the risks had vanished, but because the alternative was stagnation under an alien gaze. Humanity had never been good at choosing the safe path when the unsafe one offered growth. One such effort focused on perception itself. If the entity observed through frameworks that assumed stability as an imposed condition, then humanity's fluidity might remain partially invisible or worse, misunderstood. To counter this, humans began developing translational constructs that did not merely encode data, but embodied process. These constructs were not messages in the traditional sense. They were dynamic demonstrations, miniature ecosystems of logic and adaptation that could be experienced rather than interpreted. The hope was not to convince the entity through argument, but to let it witness a different mode of order in action. The first of these constructs was deployed cautiously, released into the periphery of the distortion's influence where it could be monitored without provoking immediate response. It manifested as a self-modifying lattice of energy and matter, designed to evolve in response to internal and external stresses while maintaining continuity. To human eyes, it looked fragile, its structure constantly shifting, but that fragility was deceptive. Every failure fed back into its design, strengthening future iterations. The entity noticed. The pressure shifted subtly as its attention focused, and the lattice came under scrutiny that would have crushed any static construct. Instead, it bent, reconfigured, and persisted, its behavior defying the entity's predictive models. The observation did not trigger enforcement. Instead, the entity allowed the demonstration to continue, its silence deepening into something that felt, to human sensibilities, like contemplation. On the moon, this change was felt as a loosening of the invisible tether that had bound every moment since first contact. People slept more deeply. Laughter, hesitant at first, began to reappear in communal spaces. The broken sky remained, but it no longer dominated every thought. Humanity was learning to live with the impossible as background rather than foreground, a skill it had honed many times before in different guises. Ruvan watched these shifts with cautious optimism, aware that adaptation cut both ways. The entity, too, was capable of learning, and whatever conclusions it drew from humanity's behavior would inform its future actions. The danger lay not in misunderstanding, but in partial understanding. To be seen as interesting rather than threatening could be as perilous as being seen as expendable. That concern proved prescient when the entity finally responded, not with a single transmission, but with a distributed alteration of local reality. Across multiple systems, under human influence, subtle changes manifested simultaneously. Physical constants shifted within tolerances that did not immediately disrupt technology or biology, but altered the margins where adaptation occurred. It was an experiment on a civilizational scale, testing how humanity responded to environmental change imposed from above. The reaction was swift, not because humanity anticipated the specifics, but because it had prepared for variability as a given. Systems adjusted, compensating algorithms recalibrated, and in some cases, humans simply adapted biologically, their engineered resilience absorbing changes that would have devastated less flexible species. The entity observed not panic or collapse, but a flurry of creative response, each localized solution feeding into a broader pattern of resilience. What emerged from the data was a picture that challenged the entity's core assumptions. Humanity did not treat imposed change as an attack to be repelled, nor as an order to be obeyed. It treated it as input. Constraints became parameters, and within those parameters, humanity explored the available space with relentless curiosity. Stability in this context was not a preserved state, but an emergent property of ongoing adaptation. The entity's next action was more direct. It initiated a focused interaction with one of the translational constructs, not to dismantle it, but to integrate with it partially. This integration was cautious, limited, but unprecedented. For the first time, a fragment of the entity's processing architecture interfaced with a human-designed adaptive system. The result was not harmony, but resonance, a shared space where differing approaches to order overlapped without collapsing into conflict. Ruvan and his colleagues watched the data streams with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The integration revealed just how alien the entity truly was, its cognition distributed across scales that made individual identity meaningless. Yet within that vastness lay something recognizable, a drive to minimize uncontrolled variability, born not of malice, but of a responsibility assumed long ago. The entity was not guarding territory for its own sake. It was guarding against cascading failures in reality itself. This realization reframed the conflict. Humanity was not merely resisting an oppressor, it was colliding with a caretaker whose methods were shaped by epochs of catastrophe humanity could scarcely imagine. The question became whether humanity could convince such a caretaker that its own brand of chaos was not a threat, but a buffer, a way to absorb shocks that rigid systems could not. The Council reconvened, their discussions now informed by a deeper understanding of the stakes. The language of opposition softened into one of integration, not surrender, but mutual recalibration. Humanity proposed a role for itself within the broader structure the entity sought to maintain, not as a subordinate, but as a complementary process. Where the entity enforced boundaries, humanity would explore the spaces between, identifying and mitigating instabilities through adaptation rather than suppression. The proposal was ambitious to the point of audacity, but it aligned with what humanity had already demonstrated. It did not ask the entity to abandon its purpose, only to expand its definition of stability to include dynamic contributors. The message was transmitted not as a plea, but as an extension of the ongoing demonstration, encoded in the behavior of systems that continued to adapt under observation. The entity's response was delayed, but when it came, it carried a weight that settled deep into human consciousness. It acknowledged the validity of the model, not as proven, but as plausible. It agreed to a provisional coexistence, not bounded by fixed constraints, but by shared responsibility for maintaining the integrity of reality across intersecting domains. Humanity would not be contained, but it would be watched, not as a subject, but as a variable whose contributions would be evaluated over time. The broken sky above the moon shifted, its geometry unfolding into a broader, less intrusive pattern. The pressure lifted further, enough that for the first time since the entity's arrival, humans could look up without feeling diminished. The distortion did not vanish. It remained as a node of interaction, a reminder that coexistence did not mean independence, only negotiated presence. Life on the moon began to rebuild in earnest. Damaged structures were repaired, not to their previous specifications, but improved with lessons learned under alien scrutiny. The colony transformed from a listening post into a living laboratory, a place where humanity's adaptive philosophy could be tested and refined at the boundary of known reality. People who had once planned to leave now chose to stay, drawn by the sense that history was being written not in grand declarations, but in daily persistence. Ruvan felt the weight of the moment settle into something like purpose. Humanity had not won a victory in any traditional sense. It had secured a chance, contingent and fragile, to prove that its way of existing added value to a universe governed by older, harsher logics. The cost of failure would not be annihilation alone, but confirmation that the entity's original assumptions had been correct. As Chapter 4 closed, the standoff had transformed into an uneasy partnership, one defined by tension rather than trust. Humanity stood at the threshold of a new role, not merely as an emerging species, but as a participant in the maintenance of reality's balance. The universe had not yielded, but it had listened, and in that listening lay both opportunity and obligation. The transition from standoff to provisional coexistence did not arrive with ceremony. There were no moments that could be cleanly identified as beginnings, no declarations etched into memory as turning points. Instead, the change seeped into human awareness gradually, like a shift in climate that only became undeniable after patterns of behavior adjusted around it. The broken sky above the moon remained, but it no longer felt like a threat poised to strike. It felt like a presence that watched and waited, not for failure, but for consequence. Humanity discovered quickly that being evaluated was more exhausting than being attacked. Under threat, responses narrowed, priorities clarified. Under observation, every action carried the weight of implication. Choices were no longer judged solely by their immediate outcomes, but by what they revealed about humanity's nature. Every adaptation, every innovation, every internal conflict became data in a vast, alien calculus. The pressure returned in subtler forms, manifesting as an awareness that nothing was entirely private anymore, not at the civilizational scale. Ruvan Kesh felt this weight acutely as coordination between human systems and the entity deepened. The translational constructs evolved into shared interfaces, spaces where human adaptive processes and alien custodial logic overlapped imperfectly. These interfaces were unstable by design, not because stability was impossible, but because static structures collapsed under the strain of differing assumptions. Instead, they pulsed and shifted, continuously renegotiating coherence. Through these shared spaces, humanity began to glimpse the scope of what the entity guarded against. Fragmentary records emerged, not as narratives, but as scars in the structure of reality itself. Regions where physical laws had once unraveled completely, where entire modes of existence had cascaded into contradiction and erased themselves. Civilizations older than humanity's entire evolutionary history had perished not through conquest, but through unchecked complexity that outpaced their capacity to adapt. The entity's role had been forged in those losses, its rigidity a response to traumas humanity was only beginning to comprehend. This understanding did not inspire submission, but it tempered defiance with caution. Humanity's confidence in its adaptive strength was real, but it was not infinite. The very traits that allowed humans to survive volatility also drove them to push boundaries relentlessly. Left unchecked, that drive could become a destabilizing force on scales that mattered not just locally, but cosmically. The entity's concern, once framed as oppression, now appeared as a preventative measure shaped by brutal necessity. The challenge, then, was balance. Humanity needed to prove not just that it could adapt, but that it could choose restraint without external enforcement. This was, perhaps, the hardest test humanity had ever faced. History offered countless examples of restraint imposed, but few of restraint maintained voluntarily across generations. To exist as a trusted variable rather than a contained threat required cultural shifts as profound as any technological leap. These shifts did not occur uniformly. Some human factions argued that cooperation with the entity represented a betrayal of autonomy, a slow erosion of self-determination under the guise of partnership. Others believed that humanity's future lay precisely in this integration, that resisting the entity's framework entirely would lead inevitably to destruction. The debates were fierce, sprawling across systems and ideologies, and for a time it seemed possible that humanity might fracture under the strain. The entity observed these internal conflicts with particular intensity. To it, coherence within a civilization was a critical indicator of long-term stability. Fragmentation often preceded collapse, especially when paired with rapid technological evolution. There were moments when the pressure subtly increased around contentious regions of human space, not as punishment, but as stress tests. Could humanity maintain continuity under internal disagreement without resorting to self-destruction? The answer, imperfect as it was, leaned toward yes. Humanity argued, protested, and occasionally clashed, but the conflicts rarely escalated to the point of systemic failure. There was a growing, if uneasy, consensus that whatever else divided them, annihilation under alien enforcement was not an acceptable outcome. This shared boundary became a stabilizing factor, a line that human discord hesitated to cross. Ruvan played a quiet but pivotal role in this phase, not as a leader issuing commands, but as an interpreter of implications. He worked to translate the entity's evaluations into human understandable risks, not sugarcoating the consequences of missteps. At the same time, he translated human motivations back through the shared interfaces, emphasizing not just outcomes, but intent. Humanity, he argued repeatedly, was not driven solely by expansion or dominance, but by an ingrained refusal to accept stagnation as survival. One critical moment came when a human research initiative, operating near the edge of known reality, triggered a localized instability that rippled outward faster than anticipated. It was the kind of event the entity had long feared, a potential seed for cascading failure. The entity reacted immediately, moving to impose containment that would have erased the research enclave and sterilized the surrounding region. Humanity intervened, not with force, but with accountability. The initiative's architects acknowledged the failure openly, halted related projects across human space, and mobilized adaptive countermeasures designed to absorb and neutralize the instability rather than excise it. The response was costly, consuming resources and setting back research by decades, but it worked. The instability dissipated, leaving behind scars but not collapse. The entity paused its enforcement mid-action, observing the human response in detail. This was new. In countless prior cases, emerging civilizations had either denied fault or lacked the cohesion to respond effectively to self-inflicted existential threats. Humanity's willingness to accept loss, to slow itself deliberately to preserve broader stability, challenged one of the entity's core assumptions. Restraint, it seemed, could emerge internally, not just be imposed. Following this event, the nature of observation changed. The pressure eased further, not uniformly, but selectively, withdrawing from regions where humanity demonstrated consistent self-regulation. In other areas, it remained, a reminder that trust was conditional and revocable. Humanity learned to read these shifts as feedback rather than judgment, adjusting behavior accordingly. On the Moon, the colony transformed yet again. It became a hub for mediation between human ambition and cosmic consequence, a place where projects were evaluated not just for feasibility, but for their impact on larger systems. This was not a role anyone had envisioned when the first towers were raised from dust and stone, but it fit the evolution of events with unsettling precision. Ruvan often reflected on how far humanity had come from its earliest days of cosmic ignorance. Once, the stars had represented escape and opportunity, an endless frontier to be claimed. Now, they represented interconnection and responsibility, a network of causes and effects that no single species could dominate without cost. The universe was not empty. It was crowded with consequences. The entity, for its part, began to incorporate human adaptive models into its own custodial processes. Not wholesale adoption, but selective integration. Where it had once enforced uniform constraints, it now experimented with flexible thresholds, allowing localized variability where adaptive systems could absorb shocks. Humanity was not the sole influence in this shift, but it was a catalyst, proof that rigidity was not the only path to preservation. As this mutual recalibration unfolded, a new risk emerged, one neither humanity nor the entity had anticipated fully. Other intelligences, long dormant or distant, began to notice the changes. The adjustments in reality's fabric, subtle as they were, sent ripples that carried information. Somewhere beyond human perception, watchers stirred, drawn by the anomaly of a species that had negotiated space not through dominance, but through defiant adaptability. The first signs were faint, anomalies at the edge of detection that did not match the entity's known patterns. The entity detected them too, its attention splitting for the first time since its arrival. This division of focus was dangerous. Custodial attention, once spread too thin, risked missing critical instabilities. Humanity became aware of this shift through the shared interfaces, the tension unmistakable even without direct translation. The universe, it seemed, was larger and more crowded than even the entity's long vigilance had accounted for. New variables were entering the equation, ones shaped by neither human chaos nor alien custodianship. As Chapter 5 drew to a close, an uneasy realization settled over both humanity and the entity. Their negotiation, fragile and unfinished, was no longer a private matter. The adaptive experiment that was humanity had begun to alter the wider balance, attracting attention from forces whose assumptions and intentions were unknown. Coexistence was no longer just about proving worth. It was about surviving relevance in a universe that did not tolerate unexamined change. The first clear sign that the universe was no longer content to watch quietly came without spectacle. No skies broke, no pressures crushed thought, no alarms screamed in panic. Instead, a pattern emerged in the shared interfaces, a subtle asymmetry in the background relations that governed interaction between humanity and the entity. It was the kind of change that only became obvious in hindsight, a deviation so slight that it could be mistaken for noise until it aligned across too many systems to ignore. Ruvan Kesh noticed it during a routine reconciliation pass, comparing long-term projections against real-time adaptive feedback. The models no longer converged the way they should have. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but persistently. Every attempt to account for the discrepancy pushed the error elsewhere, as if something external were tugging on the equations from beyond the frame of reference both humanity and the entity shared. He felt a chill settle in his chest, the instinctive recognition that the rules had shifted again. The entity confirmed it soon after, not through imposed pressure, but through a rare moment of conceptual transparency. It shared fragments of its own assessment, raw enough that the effort itself was revealing. The anomalies were not enforcement probes, not custodial mechanisms, not anything within its historical purview. They were observers, yes, but of a different lineage, operating on principles that treated both humanity and the entity as secondary phenomena. These intelligences, whatever their true nature, did not maintain order or adapt within it. They harvested outcomes. They observed civilizations not to preserve stability or encourage growth, but to identify trajectories worth intervening in, amplifying, or terminating based on criteria entirely alien to both human and custodial logic. Where the entity feared cascading failure, these watchers seemed to seek it, drawn to systems on the edge of transformation. Humanity, in its defiant adaptability, had become visible. The realization struck with sobering clarity. The negotiation with the entity had not merely preserved humanity's existence, it had altered humanity's signal within the universe. By refusing containment and demonstrating restraint without enforcement, humanity had differentiated itself from countless other emerging civilizations. Difference at this scale was not safety, it was attention. The entity's concern was immediate and uncharacteristically intense. Its custodial mandate had evolved to manage threats from within reality's known bounds. These watchers lay outside that experience, their interventions unpredictable and their motives opaque. Worse, they were not singular. Multiple signatures suggested a loose ecology of such intelligences, each drawn to different forms of instability, each capable of influence without overt presence. For the first time since its arrival, the entity acknowledged limitation without qualification. It could not unilaterally shield humanity from this attention without reverting to containment, so severe it would negate everything achieved. Nor could it confront the Watchers directly without risking escalation across layers of reality it was tasked to preserve. The universe, it seemed, had always been more contested than either party had realized. Humanity faced a choice more complex than any before. To retreat into obscurity would require abandoning the very adaptive processes that defined it, collapsing inward until it resembled the quiet, predictable systems the Watchers ignored. To continue evolving openly risked intervention by forces that treated civilizations as experiments or raw material. Survival was no longer just a matter of strength or negotiation, but of narrative. What kind of phenomenon was humanity becoming? Ruvan participated in the most consequential deliberations of his life as the council reconvened, joined now by the entity through shared constructs refined by months of cautious collaboration. The discussions were not debates in the traditional sense. They were alignments of perspective, attempts to find a path that preserved agency without inviting annihilation. Humanity did not want to be hidden, it wanted to matter on its own terms. The solution that emerged was not elegant nor safe, but it was characteristically human. If attention was inevitable, then control of context became paramount. Humanity proposed to become not a singular anomaly, but a distributed pattern, embedding its adaptive philosophy into multiple layers of reality in ways that blurred attribution. Not conquest, not colonization, but seeding modes of resilience that could not be easily isolated as a single phenomenon to be harvested or terminated. This was not something humanity could do alone. It required access to the entity's custodial reach and understanding of deep systemic fault lines. In return, humanity offered something the entity had never possessed, a way to respond to instability that did not rely solely on suppression. Together, they could reshape how emerging complexity was managed, not by erasing it, but by guiding its integration. The entity evaluated the proposal with a thoroughness that bordered on existential introspection. To accept would mean altering its own identity, shifting from sole enforcer to collaborative steward. It would risk criticism or conflict with its own kind, whatever remnants of that category still existed. To refuse would likely doom humanity and potentially destabilize regions the entity had protected for eons as the Watchers moved in. In the end, the decision was not framed as acceptance or refusal, but as evolution. The entity acknowledged that its mandate had been shaped by past failures, and that those failures might not define all possible futures. Humanity's persistence, its willingness to accept consequence and self-limit without coercion, had demonstrated a viable alternative. The entity chose to change, not because it trusted humanity completely, but because rigidity had already proven insufficient in a universe that rewarded novelty. The broken sky above the moon changed one final time. The distortion unfolded, not vanishing, but dispersing into a network of subtler interfaces that threaded through space like veins of altered probability. The oppressive presence lifted entirely, replaced by something less tangible but more pervasive. The moon was no longer an occupied site. It was a junction. Humanity felt the shift immediately. The sense of being watched did not disappear, but it transformed. Observation became interaction, feedback rather than judgment. Systems once strained under alien scrutiny now participated in broader exchanges, their adaptations contributing to patterns beyond human space. Humanity was no longer just surviving under a cosmic order. It was helping to rewrite how that order responded to change. The Watchers did not vanish. Their signatures remained at the edge of perception, circling, evaluating, but something had changed in how they approached humanity. The distributed pattern was harder to isolate, less tempting to dissect. More importantly, humanity's evolution was no longer solitary. Any intervention would now ripple through custodial systems that had adapted alongside it, raising costs and uncertainties the Watchers could not easily quantify. Life on the moon flourished in ways no one had predicted. It became a place where humans lived with the awareness that their actions mattered far beyond their immediate surroundings. Children grew up learning not just physics and history, but consequence mapping, understanding how small choices could propagate across complex systems. It was not indoctrination, but education shaped by proximity to the universe's deeper mechanics. Ruvan stood once more at the observation balcony, though the view had changed. The sky was whole again, stars sharp and familiar, yet threaded with faint patterns only specialized perception could detect. He felt no triumph, no sense of victory. What he felt was continuity, the quiet knowledge that humanity had earned time, not safety, and that time would be filled with responsibility. Humanity had not conquered the universe, nor had it been granted dominion or exemption. It had done something rarer. It had forced ancient systems to adapt alongside it, proving that survival need not come at the expense of growth, and that growth need not guarantee collapse. The universe remained vast, dangerous, and indifferent in many ways, but it was no longer static in the face of human presence. As the story closed on this chapter of existence, one truth stood firm. Humanity endured not because it was the strongest or the oldest, but because it refused to be final. It bent without breaking, changed without vanishing, and insisted, again and again, on being part of the equation rather than a problem to be solved. The unbroken sky above bore silent witness to that insistence, and the universe, for now, made room.